The rain in Greenwich, Connecticut did not fall so much as it attacked. It came in sideways off Long Island Sound, driving hard against the colonial facades of the wealthiest zip codes in New England, turning the blue stone driveways into mirrors of black ice and freezing everything it touched into something brittle and sharp. On the night of November 14th, 3 days after Sloane Hargrove turned 16, the rain came for her personally. She had lived in the house on Alderton Road for her entire life. She knew every creak in the back staircase, every draft that whistled through the third-floor window, no matter how many times the contractors were called to fix it. She knew the way the morning light came through the kitchen skylights in the summer and turned the white marble countertops gold. And she knew the particular silence of the house at night, a deep, insulated quiet that only comes from walls built thick enough to keep the rest of the world entirely out. It was the silence of old money and older pride. It was the silence her father had filled with his laughter and his drafting pencils and the low, tuneless hum he made when he was working through a problem. It was the silence that had become something else entirely after Thomas Hargrove died. Thomas had been an architect, not in the way that some men are technically architects, credentialed and competent in content to design suburban office parks and strip mall renovations. Thomas Hargrove was the kind of architect people flew in from other cities to meet. His firm, Hargrove and Strand, had buildings standing in Boston and New York and Philadelphia, structures that made people stop on the sidewalk and look up and feel, without quite knowing why, that the world was a more thoughtful place than they had previously assumed. He was meticulous and passionate and genuinely kind, which is a rarer combination in ambitious men than it ought to be. He had a signet ring in silver that he wore on his right hand, a family piece old and slightly tarnished in the grooves of the engraved crest. Sloane used to trace the pattern of it with her fingertip when she was very small, and he would hold her hand while they walked. She remembered that with a clarity that sometimes ambushed her at unexpected moments in the bread aisle of a grocery store, or at the edge of sleep, the exact cool weight of that ring against her small fingers. Thomas died 3 years before the night of the rain. He was driving south on I-95 on a Tuesday evening in October, returning from a client meeting in New Haven, when his car drifted across the center median and went into the guardrail at highway speed. The state police investigation took 5 weeks and produced a report of 42 pages that concluded in the careful, neutral language of official documents that Thomas Hargrove had likely suffered a cardiac event triggered by acute financial stress. His firm was in trouble, the report noted. Loans were defaulting. A major commercial contract had fallen through. The report was thorough and entirely wrong, but nobody knew that yet. What everybody knew was that the house on Alderton Road became a different place after Thomas was gone. It became the silence without the hum. Victor Kane arrived 8 months later. Sloane was 13 years old when Victor first appeared at a dinner party her mother hosted in the early spring, a Tuesday evening gathering of the kind that Margaret Hargrove had always organized with careful social precision. Victor was a partner at Kane and Associates, a real estate law firm with offices in Hartford and a satellite presence in New York. He was 51 years old, silver at the temples, and possessed of a particular kind of handsome that comes not from good genetics, but from money spent on the maintenance of appearance. His suits were always the right weight for the season. His shoes were always shined. He spoke in the measured, authoritative cadence of a man who had spent decades in conference rooms and courtrooms and had learned to hold a room without raising his voice. Sloane did not like him from the first evening. She could not have articulated it at 13 in any precise way, but there was something in the arrangement of his face when he thought no one was watching. A particular slackness around the jaw. A flatness behind the eyes when Margaret laughed at something he had said. A flatness that passed in an instant and was replaced by attentiveness so complete it looked almost rehearsed. Sloane noticed it the way children sometimes notice things that adults have trained themselves not to see. A flicker of the mechanism behind the performance there and gone before you could be certain you had seen it at all. Margaret noticed nothing. Or perhaps Margaret needed not to notice, which is a different thing entirely. After Thomas died, Margaret Hargrove had come apart in the quiet way that well-bred New England women sometimes do, not dramatically, not in any way that would have been visible to her social circle or required acknowledgement, but in small and incremental surrenders. She stopped hosting the dinner parties for almost a year. She stopped calling her friends from the junior league. She took her antidepressants with white wine in the evenings and watched television until the house was fully dark. She was not a cruel woman. She was not a stupid woman. She was a woman who had built her entire sense of safety around a man she genuinely loved. And when that man was suddenly gone, the architecture of her inner life had no load-bearing walls left standing. Victor Kane walked into that structural void and made himself indispensable with the smooth efficiency of someone who had done this kind of thing before. By the time Sloane was 14, Victor was at the house 4 or 5 nights a week. By the time she was 15, he and Margaret were engaged. By the time Sloane turned 16 that November, he had already quietly begun the work of dismantling everything her father had built. She saw it happening, but she did not yet understand the full shape of what she was seeing. What she saw were the smaller signs, the leased Mercedes in the driveway that replaced her mother's paid-off Volvo. The contractor who appeared one spring morning to begin a renovation of the kitchen that nobody had discussed, and that seemed upon reflection to have been motivated more by the contractor's invoices than by any genuine need. The way Victor handled the household accounts now, a responsibility Margaret had ceded to him with visible relief somewhere around month 6 of their relationship. The way certain antique pieces in the living room disappeared and were replaced with new furniture that was more expensive, but somehow less present, less inhabited, as if the house itself was being quietly hollowed out and refilled with approximations. Sloane kept a small notebook. It was a brown leather composition book she bought at the pharmacy on Greenwich Avenue with her own money. She began writing things down not because she had any plan, but because something in her, some instinct that may have inherited her father's architectural precision, needed to impose order on what she was observing. She wrote dates. She wrote amounts when she could see them. She wrote the names of the people Victor met with in the study with the door closed. She wrote the name Prescott Whitson, which she had seen on a business card on Victor's desk, Northeast Capital Bank, Vice President of Commercial Lending. She wrote it down without knowing why it mattered. She only knew that it felt like something that should be remembered. Brett Kane moved into the house in September, 2 months before the night of the rain. He was Victor's son from his first marriage, 22 years old, with a looseness about him that was not the looseness of ease, but of a person whose grip on things was perpetually uncertain. He was handsome in the way his father was handsome, which is to say performatively, and he spent his evenings on his phone and his weekends somewhere unspecified. Margaret called him charming. Sloane watched him the way she watched his father, carefully, and always from a position he could not read. In the third week of October, Margaret noticed that her Cartier watch was missing from the jewelry box on her vanity. She mentioned it at dinner in a vague, uncertain way, the way people mention things they do not want to be true. Victor immediately turned to Sloane with an expression of measured concern. Sloane saw the turn coming before it arrived. Brett had pawned the watch at a shop in Stamford. Sloane knew this because she had followed him there on a Saturday afternoon, curious in the way that had become habitual, and had watched through the shop window as he handed the watch across the glass display case to the man behind the counter. She had written the shop's name and address in her notebook. She told Victor this at dinner. She said it plainly and without elaboration, the way her father had always taught her to present a fact. She said she had seen Brett pawn the watch and could provide the address of the shop where it currently sat. Victor looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Margaret. Then he thanked Sloane for her perspective and suggested, in the tone of a man who is being magnanimous about something that does not require magnanimity, that perhaps there had been a misunderstanding. The watch was never retrieved. Brett was never confronted. And something shifted in the air of the house on Alderton Road, something that Sloane could feel in her chest without being able to name. 3 weeks later, on the evening of November 14th, Victor came home from his office in Hartford with a small plastic evidence bag in his hand. Inside the bag were 7 prescription pills, orange and oblong, and a pawn shop receipt with Sloane's name handwritten in the customer line. She had never seen the pills before. She had never been to the pawn shop whose name appeared on the receipt, a different shop from the one in Stamford where Brett had taken the watch. The handwriting on the receipt was not her own. These were things she knew with the absolute certainty of a person who has not done the thing they are being accused of. But as she stood in the foyer of the house on Alderton Road and looked at her mother's face, she understood with a slow and terrible clarity that certainty was not what mattered here. What mattered was the paper Victor Kane produced next. It was a legal document folded in thirds, printed on cream-colored paper, and bearing the raised notarial seal of a Hartford public notary. Victor unfolded it with the careful deliberateness of a man performing a gesture he had rehearsed many times in private. He laid it on the hall table next to the bag of pills and smoothed the crease with one finger. Margaret's signature was already on it. The notary's stamp was dated November 1st, 13 days ago. Sloane looked at the document and then at her mother and then back at the document and the thing that struck her. The thing that hit her with the force of a physical blow somewhere beneath her sternum was not the betrayal, though the betrayal was enormous. It was the date. The date told her that this document had been prepared and signed before the watch went missing, before the evidence bag, before tonight's dinner table performance. The accusation was not the cause of what was happening. It was the pretext. The cause was something older and more deliberate than anything that had happened in the last 3 weeks. Victor Kane had not acted in anger or frustration or moral outrage over a 16-year-old's alleged behavior. He had prepared a legal instrument, had it witnessed and notarized, and then manufactured the occasion to use it. The document was a petition for emancipation. By signing it, Margaret was legally relinquishing her parental rights over Sloane Hargrove and declaring her daughter capable of independent living, which would, under Connecticut law, terminate Sloane's status as a dependent minor. It would also, Sloane would learn later from a law book in a public library, create significant legal complications for any challenges she might bring to the administration of the Hargrove Family Trust. A fund established by her father in the amount of $2,800,000 structured to transfer fully to Sloane on her 18th birthday. Victor did not explain any of this in the foyer. He did not need to. He simply said that he would not have a thief and a drug user under his roof, that Margaret was in complete agreement, and that Sloane had 1 hour to collect her belongings. Sloane looked at her mother one final time. Margaret's eyes were fixed on the floor at a point approximately 2 feet in front of her shoes. Her hands were clasped together in her lap with a tension that made the knuckles white. She did not look up. Sloane went upstairs and packed 2 bags. She was methodical about it. She took her clothes and her toiletries and her father's photograph from the nightstand and the brown leather notebook from the back of her desk drawer. She took $47 from the ceramic jar on her bookshelf, where she kept her savings from the 2 afternoons a week she had spent babysitting for the Alderton Road neighbors. She did not cry. She was not performing stoicism. She simply felt, as she moved through the familiar rooms of the house where she had spent her entire life, that the part of herself that required comfort from this place had already gone quiet, already retreated to somewhere interior and armored that she had not previously known existed. The door closed behind her with a heavy hollow click. The deadbolt turned. She heard it through the wood of the door as clearly as if she were still standing in the foyer. The rain came down on her immediately hard and sideways, and within 30 seconds her denim jacket was soaked through. She started walking. The first 6 months were a sustained exercise in humiliation of a very particular kind, the kind that is quiet and constant and entirely invisible to the world at large. Sloane moved through the homes of 3 different friends from her school, sleeping on floors and pull-out sofas, and in one case an inflatable mattress, in a craft room surrounded by her host mother's fabric collection and unfinished quilts. Each arrangement ended the same way, not with cruelty, not with anything dramatic, but with a growing discomfort, a slight cooling in the family's manner toward her, a conversation her friend would report in halting apologetic fragments. It was too complicated. It was not sustainable. She understood. She always said she understood. She called Margaret once from a payphone outside a convenience store in January. It was 11 degrees outside and the wind off the sound was cutting enough to make her eyes water. She fed coins into the phone with fingers she could barely feel. Margaret answered on the second ring. There was a silence between them that lasted perhaps 4 seconds, and then Margaret said quietly and without inflection that she could not do this and disconnected the call. Sloane stood at the payphone for another minute with the receiver still in her hand, not because she expected anyone to call back, but because putting it down felt like closing something that could not be reopened. Then she put it down and walked back into the convenience store to warm her hands. She found a room in Bridgeport in February. It was on the second floor of a building on Stratford Avenue, 300 square feet, with a window that overlooked the parking lot of an auto repair shop that operated 7 days a week, 6 in the morning until 9 at night, and whose air compressors and hydraulic lifts and occasional radio provided a continuous industrial soundtrack to the lower half of Sloane's 16th year. The room cost $340 a month. It smelled of mildew and the previous tenant's cigarettes, and the baseboard heaters made a sound like a small animal trying to escape through a metal duct. She got a job at O'Malley's Diner on Fairfield Avenue 3 days after moving in. The owner, a man named Dennis Calloway, who wore the same Red Sox cap every day and communicated primarily in single syllables, hired her without asking many questions, which she appreciated. The work was physical and relentless and paid $7.80 an hour, plus whatever tips the lunch and dinner crowds left behind, which was not a figure that invited optimism. She learned to make a $20 bill last 9 days. She learned to eat her shift meal slowly and to take the surplus dinner rolls home in her jacket pocket. She learned to sleep with a baseball bat under the bed frame, not because the neighborhood was particularly dangerous, but because the specific texture of aloneness in that room at 2 in the morning made preparation feel like the only available form of comfort. She kept writing in the brown leather notebook. By the time she was 17, the notebook had filled, and she had started a second. She was not entirely sure what she was building. It felt less like investigation and more like the maintenance of a private record, a refusal to let the facts disappear under the weight of passing time. She wrote down everything she could reconstruct about Victor Kane's financial activities during the years she had lived in the same house with him. The contractor's invoices, the name Prescott Whitson, the shell company name she had seen on a document on Victor's desk one afternoon when the study door had been left ajar, a name she had written immediately and without fully understanding its significance. Apex Meridian, LLC. She went to the public library on Broad Street on her days off and read whatever she could find about trust, law, estate management, and the legal mechanics of emancipation. The research was slow and often dense, the language of legal texts designed more to exclude lay readers than to inform them. But she was patient. She had developed a capacity for patience that she recognized was something close to dark humor as the primary gift her current circumstances had provided. She had nowhere to be. She had nothing to protect. She had time and a library card and the focused intensity of someone with a score to settle and no deadline on the settling. On her 18th birthday, she took the bus to Hartford and sat in the public records office for 3 hours with a printout of her father's trust documentation that she had obtained through a formal records request the previous month. She cross-referenced the account numbers with the transfers she had been able to piece together from memory and from public filings. Apex Meridian, LLC had administered fees, penalties, and investment redirections totaling approximately $2,800,000 over the preceding 26 months. The trust account balance, as of her 18th birthday, was $412. She sat with that number for a long time. The fluorescent lights in the records office made everything the color of old paper. A clock on the wall ticked with an unhurried regularity that seemed in that moment almost offensive. She wrote the number down. She wrote Apex Meridian, LLC beside it, and beneath that she wrote the date, and beneath that she wrote the name Prescott Whitson for what felt like the 100th time, though now it sat differently on the page. Now it had weight that was adjacent to certainty. She took the bus back to Bridgeport and worked the dinner shift at O'Malley's and said nothing to anyone. The months that followed her 18th birthday were the hardest, though not in the way the months immediately after being thrown out had been hard. Those months had been an emergency full of the compressed urgency of immediate need. These months were something else. These months were the long gray expanse of a life that had stabilized into something functional, but entirely absent of possibility. She was surviving. She was paying her rent and eating adequately and showing up to her shifts without complaint. But the horizon had gone flat. There was nothing out ahead of her that she could locate or name or move toward. She turned 19 in November of the following year. She bought a cupcake from the gas station on the corner. She sat in her room and ate it at the window that overlooked the auto repair shop. And she let herself feel for exactly the duration of eating that cupcake the full weight of what had been taken from her. Not just the money, not just the house on Alderton Road. The future. The version of her life that would have been built on her father's love and intention. The education he had saved and planned for the possibilities he had arranged. Victor Kane had not merely stolen a financial instrument, he had stolen a trajectory. She finished the cupcake and threw the wrapper away and washed her hands and did not allow herself any further time in that territory. Self-pity was a specific kind of poverty she had decided somewhere around month 4 of the Bridgeport room she could not afford. The next morning was a Tuesday. She was working the breakfast shift, which meant she arrived at O'Malley's at 5:45, started the coffee urns and set the counter stools for the morning regulars. A rotation of construction workers, long-haul drivers fueling up on Route 1 and 2, retired men named Carl and Desmond who came in every weekday morning without fail and ordered the same things and argued pleasantly about the same subjects. Baseball standings and municipal politics in the general comparative merits of engines manufactured before and after 1985. She was refilling the second coffee urn when Dennis came through from the back with an envelope in his hand. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope, the quality of paper that exists in a different category from the envelopes that contain utility bills and credit card promotions. Her name was written on the front in careful, formal script. The return address was in Boston. Nash and Associates Attorneys at Law, Boston, Massachusetts. She held it for a moment before opening it. The envelope had an authority to it that was almost physical, a specific gravity that she felt in her palm before she understood its source. She set the coffee urn down. She took the envelope to the far end of the counter where the light was better and used a butter knife to open it cleanly along the top edge. The letter inside was formal and precise and took less than 3 paragraphs to change the entire direction of her life. It informed her that she was the sole named beneficiary in the last will and testament of one Dorothy Eleanor Hargrove, her father's aunt who had passed away 17 days prior at her home in Rhinebeck, New York. The estate included liquid assets of approximately $4,200,000 held in an irrevocable trust structured to pass directly to Sloan without probate. The estate also included real property, specifically the Hargrove Estate, a 70-acre private holding in Dutchess County near Rhinebeck, New York. 4 generations in the Hargrove family now transferred free and clear. Travel arrangements and temporary accommodations had been made. Her presence was required at the offices of Nash and Associates at her earliest convenience. At the bottom of the page was a handwritten note, 3 lines in a cursive, that was elegant and slightly uneven in the way of someone elderly who still writes with the habits of an earlier era. It said only, "I know what was done to you. I know what was done to your father. Come to Boston. We have work to do." Sloan read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully back into the envelope and put the envelope in the pocket of her apron. She walked to the coffee urn and finished filling it. She went back to work. It was a small act of composure, deliberate and private. She was not calm. Her hands were shaking slightly. Her heart was doing something complicated in her chest, some mixture of hope and suspicion and a grief she could not immediately locate the source of. But she had learned in 3 years the value of finishing the thing in front of you before you allowed yourself to look up. The coffee needed to be ready by 6. Carl and Desmond would be through the door by 6:10. She finished her shift at 2. She told Dennis she needed a few days. He looked at her over the rim of his Red Sox cap and said, "Fine." She drove the Bridgeport bus to New Haven and then the Amtrak to Boston and arrived at the offices of Nash and Associates at 4:45 in the afternoon. The building was a brownstone on Beacon Hill, quiet and serious, with the restrained confidence of a firm that had never needed to advertise itself. The receptionist led her to a conference room on the third floor that looked out over a narrow cobblestone street and the early November sky going pale above the rooftops. The room had built-in shelving Persian rugs over wide plank floors and a mahogany table that was old enough to have been polished by people who were now themselves historical. Elliot Nash was already in the room when she entered. He was a tall man in his early 60s, lean in the way that comes from discipline rather than metabolism, with a white-collared shirt and no tie, and the reading glasses of a man who has finally made his peace with needing them. He stood when she came in. He looked at her worn boots and her diner jacket and the steadiness in her face, the kind that comes from years of not flinching from things, and he nodded to himself very slightly, as if something he had expected had been confirmed. She sat across the table from him. He poured water from a pitcher and pushed a glass toward her, and did not begin with the preambles that lawyers often use to seem personable. He simply opened the leather binder in front of him and said, "Let me tell you about your Aunt Dorothy." Dorothy Hargrove was 81 years old when she died. She had never married. She had lived for the last 40 years at the Hargrove estate in Rhinebeck alone, except for a rotating staff of two, a housekeeper and a groundskeeper, both of whom had been with her for over 15 years and had been generously provided for in separate arrangements. She was in the social world of the Hudson Valley considered an eccentric. She had declined most invitations. She had maintained very few social relationships. She had from the outside appeared to be simply a wealthy old woman who had chosen a quiet and solitary life. Elliot Nash paused. He took off his reading glasses and set them on the table. He said that the appearance of quiet and solitude had been exactly that, an appearance. Dorothy Hargrove had spent 40 years collecting information about the kind of people who use power quietly and illegally and with enough sophistication to avoid accountability. She had done this not as a vigilante, not with any dramatic intention of exposure, but out of a particular philosophy about the relationship between knowledge and protection. She had believed that information carefully gathered and meticulously preserved was the only reliable form of armor against certain categories of human predation. She had been right often enough to continue. When Thomas Hargrove died in that car accident on I-95, Dorothy did not accept the official account. She had known Thomas, had stayed close to him in his adult life, in a way she had not stayed close to the broader family, and she knew the quality of his mind and the state of his finances, and the particular way in which they had begun to deteriorate in the 18 months before his death. She had also known, long before Margaret did something about Victor Kane. Elliot Nash picked his glasses up again. He said that Dorothy had retained a private forensic investigator 4 months after Thomas died. He said that the investigator's report, completed the following year, had concluded that the mechanical failure in Thomas Hargrove's Mercedes was not consistent with ordinary wear. He said this with the careful evenness of a man delivering a fact that he knew would land with the force of something heavier. Then he stopped speaking and let the silence hold for a moment before he continued. He said that Dorothy had sat with this information for years. He said that she had added to it, built around it, corroborated it through additional investigation and through the extensive archive she had already been constructing for decades. He said that she had considered going to law enforcement twice, and had both times concluded that the evidence, though compelling, was not yet sufficient to survive the resources Victor Kane would bring to its dismantlement. He said that Dorothy had also known about Sloan. He said this carefully, watching her face as he said it. Dorothy had known about the Emancipation Papers. She had known about the trust fund's depletion. She had known about Bridgeport and about O'Malley's Diner and about the brown leather notebook. Sloan set her water glass down very carefully. She said she was watching me. Elliot Nash said yes. She said, "For how long?" He said, "Since the night you left the house on Alderton Road." The room was very quiet for a moment. Outside the window, a car moved along the cobblestones. The pale sky was going darker at its edges. Sloan said, "If she knew, why didn't she help me?" Elliot Nash was quiet for a moment before he answered. He said that Dorothy had believed two things simultaneously: that intervening during Sloan's minority would have created legal vulnerabilities that Victor Kane would have immediately exploited, and that the resilience Sloan would need for what came next could not be given to her. It had to be built. He said this without apology or sentimentality, which was Sloan recognized the respectful way to say it. He said that Dorothy had waited until Sloan was 19, legally independent in every sense, in possession of her adult faculties and her accumulated knowledge before activating the will. He slid a heavy brass key across the table. It was antique hand-forged with a star-shaped bit that caught the conference room light. He said it was the only physical key that existed for a specific lock on the Hargrove estate property. He said that Sloan would understand its purpose when she arrived at the estate. He said there was one more thing. He opened a different section of the binder and produced a single sheet of paper. It was a timeline typed and annotated that began with a company formation date. The company was called Apex Meridian, LLC. It had been incorporated in Delaware. Its registered agent address was a law office in Hartford, Connecticut. The incorporation date was 11 months before Thomas Hargrove died. Sloan looked at the page. She looked at the incorporation date. She looked at the name of the registered agent, which was the firm Kane and Associates. Victor Kane had not waited until Thomas was gone to begin constructing the mechanism for his financial destruction. He had built it first. Then Thomas died. Elliot Nash said nothing further. He understood that the information required space. Sloan sat in the mahogany conference room on Beacon Hill and looked at the timeline and felt something happen in the geography of her inner life. Some tectonic shift that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but contained the compressed energy of both. The woman at the diner with the shaking hands and the brown leather notebook had known on some instinctive level that she was missing something. She had known that what she could see was not the complete picture, that the frame was larger than the portion visible to her, that somewhere off screen was the thing that would make everything cohere. Here was the edge of that thing. Here was the shape of it beginning to emerge. She folded her hands on the table. She looked at Elliot Nash and told him she would need directions to the estate. He gave them to her. He also gave her a card with his direct line and a folder with the financial documentation for the liquid assets. He said his firm would support whatever she decided to do, that Dorothy had established a specific legal fund for exactly that purpose. He said he was available whenever she was ready. She stood. She shook his hand. She took the brass key and the folder and walked back out through the quiet brownstone building and down the steps to the cobblestone street, where the November evening had come fully down and the air smelled of wood smoke and the Charles River somewhere close by. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The key was in her hand, the star-shaped bit pressed against her palm with a cold specificity, the exact opposite of soft, the opposite of yielding. She closed her fingers around it. She had $47 and a diner jacket and a second-hand bus ticket stub in her pocket, and she was standing on the edge of something that her father had built, and Dorothy had protected, and Victor Kane had believed he had destroyed entirely. He had been wrong about a number of things. He was about to be wrong about the rest of them. She walked to the bus station. She had a drive to plan and a life to reclaim, and somewhere beneath the dark hills of the Hudson Valley, a house full of secrets that had been waiting 3 years for her to come home to them. The drive from Boston to Rhinebeck took 4 hours in the used Jeep she bought the following morning from a dealer in Somerville, paying cash from the advance Elliot Nash had wired to the new account his firm had established in her name. It was the first significant purchase she had made in 3 years that was not an act of pure survival, and the experience of it was strange enough that she sat in the dealer's parking lot for several minutes after the transaction was complete, her hands on the steering wheel of a vehicle that actually belonged to her, trying to locate the feeling that was supposed to accompany this kind of moment. What she found instead was a kind of suspended alertness, the sensation of someone standing at the top of a staircase in the dark, knowing there are steps ahead, but unable to see where they go. She drove west and then south through the November landscape of interior New England, through small towns with white-clapboard churches and bare-limbed trees, and the late autumn light that turns everything to pewter and amber. She crossed into New York State at the Rhinecliff Bridge, and the Hudson River opened beneath her, wide and cold and absolutely still in the windless afternoon, reflecting the pale sky back at itself with the precision of a mirror. She had never been to Rhinebeck. She had never been to Dutchess County. She was driving toward a house she had never seen to claim an inheritance from a woman she barely remembered, guided by a set of handwritten directions on Nash and Associates letterhead and a brass key with a star-shaped bit that sat on the passenger seat beside her, like a compass pointing in a direction that had no name yet. The private road was easy to miss. It branched off Route 9G without signage, a narrow gravel lane that disappeared almost immediately into a corridor of mature Norway spruce. Their branches interlocked overhead to form a tunnel that blocked the light and reduced the world to a green-black corridor of compressed silence. She drove slowly. The Jeep's tires crunched over centuries of accumulated gravel, each stone pressed down by the weight of generations of people who had made this same approach, none of whom she had known. The gates at the end of the lane were wrought iron, 12 feet high, anchored to stone pillars that were themselves anchored to a low stone wall that ran off in both directions into the trees, and eventually she would learn enclose the entire perimeter of the 70 acres. The ironwork was elaborate botanical in its complexity, vines and leaves worked into the metal with a craftsmanship that spoke of another century and considerably different economics. At the center of each gate was the Hargrove family crest, a design she recognized from her father's signet ring, the one she had traced with her fingertip as a very small child. Seeing it at this scale, rendered in oxidized iron against the November sky, produced a sensation she was not prepared for, something lodged between recognition and loss. The ache of encountering something beloved in a context where it does not yet belong to you. She pressed the button on the electronic fob from Elliot Nash's folder. The gate mechanism ground awake with the sound of machinery that had been dormant too long. Metal against metal, the protest of hinges that needed oil and attention. Then it opened. The driveway curved through an overgrowth of weeping willows, their bare winter branches hanging in long curtains that brushed the Jeep's roof as she passed beneath them. She came around the final bend and the house presented itself. Hargrove Estate had been built in 1921 by her great-great-grandfather, a shipping merchant who had made his money in the movement of goods along the northeastern seaboard and had chosen to spend a portion of it on a statement of permanence. The house was Victorian Gothic in its architecture, built from dark gray Hudson Valley bluestone, with steeply pitched gables and tall, narrow chimneys, and a wraparound porch supported by elaborate wooden brackets that had been painted and repainted over the decades until the paint layers themselves had become structural. It was 3 stories tall at its central mass and spread laterally into wings on both sides, east and west, each wing with its own roofline and its own chimneys. The whole composition resembling nothing so much as a building that had grown organically over time, rather than been designed all at once. Though the original architectural drawings, which she would later find rolled in the study, showed that this effect of organic accumulation had been deliberately designed from the beginning. It was beautiful. It was also deeply neglected. The porch railing had sections missing. The roof line showed the dark staining of old water damage along 2 of the eastern gables. The grounds were not so much overgrown as surrendered. The formal gardens she could see to the south, reduced to the architectural bones of what they had been. Box hedges, grown enormous and shapeless. Rose canes sprawling without support across what had once been defined beds. The weeping willows needed serious attention. The gravel of the main drive had long since been colonized by grass growing up through its center. She sat in the Jeep in front of the house for a moment. The afternoon light was going quickly the way it does in November in the Hudson Valley, dropping from pale gold to gray in what feels like minutes. She could see her breath in the cold air when she stepped out. She stood on the overgrown gravel and looked up at the facade of the house and felt with a certainty she could not explain that the house was aware of her arrival in some way that was not mystical but structural. As if the weight of her footstep on the front porch changed something in the balance of the building's long patience. The key from Elliot Nash was the estate key, and it opened the front door. Inside, the air was cold and still and smelled of time itself, the layered accumulation of old wood and beeswax and dust, and the dry mineral scent of a stone building that has been sealed against winter without heat. Everything was covered in white canvas drop cloths. The chandelier in the entry hall, the furniture in the formal parlor visible through the wide doorway to the left, the grand piano in the music room. The shapes beneath the canvas were softened and anonymous. Familiar objects transformed by their coverings into something ghostly and approximate. She stood in the entrance hall for a long moment. Then she took off her jacket and draped it over the newel post at the base of the staircase and went to find the thermostat. The next 2 weeks established a rhythm that was in its own way restorative. She hired a local landscaping crew to begin the exterior work, the overgrown grounds, and the failing porch railing, and the long-neglected roof assessment. But the interior she kept entirely for herself. There was something in the work of it that she needed to do with her own hands, something that the 3 years in Bridgeport had made her understand about the relationship between physical labor and the reestablishment of agency. When she scrubbed the intricate woodwork of the main staircase, she was not merely cleaning. When she pulled the canvas drop cloths from the furniture one room at a time and folded them carefully and stacked them in the carriage house, she was doing something closer to an act of restoration whose primary beneficiary was not the house. She worked from early morning until the light failed in the afternoon. She cooked simple meals in the kitchen, which turned out to be enormous and well-equipped in a dated but functional way. She slept in a bedroom on the second floor that she chose for its eastward-facing windows and its view across the neglected formal garden to the tree line where the bare November trees stood in the kind of clear winter silence that makes you believe in the possibility of things starting over. She found Dorothy's journals in the main study on the third day. The study was a room that occupied the full width of the east wing on the ground floor, lined floor to ceiling with shelving that held a combination of books and framed photographs and the accumulated objects of a long, solitary intellectual life. The desk was enormous dark mahogany, positioned to face the garden windows. On the shelves behind the desk, arranged in a sequence that appeared chronological, were 14 leather-bound journals of varying sizes, their spines labeled not with years, but with what appeared to be a private cataloging system of letters and numbers that she could not immediately decode. She took the most recent journal down and opened it. The handwriting was the same cursive she recognized from the note at the bottom of Elliot Nash's letter. Deliberate, slightly uneven, the handwriting of someone old enough to have been taught penmanship as a discipline. She read for an hour, turning the pages carefully. The journal was not a diary in any conventional sense. It contained almost nothing of the personal or emotional. What it contained were entries that read more like intelligence reports than personal reflection. Careful records of observations and transactions and connections. The ongoing work of a woman who had spent decades maintaining what she called in one recurring phrase, the accounting of things that are not otherwise accounted for. Dorothy's name for Victor Kane in these journals was simply the instrument. He was not the first person referred to by a functional title rather than a name. The journals made it clear that Dorothy had been doing this work, this quiet, sustained accumulation of information about the conduct of powerful men and women in the Northeastern Corridor for long enough that she had developed her own private taxonomy. The phrase that appeared most frequently in the most recent journals was one that Sloane copied into her own brown notebook on the first reading. Dorothy wrote it in the margin of one entry and again in the body of another, apparently as a kind of self-reminder. It said, "The evidence must survive me. It must be in a form that cannot be undone by the death of a single keeper." On the fourth day, Sloane sat down with the original architectural drawings she had found rolled in a cardboard tube on the lower shelf of the study, and she began to cross-reference them against the actual dimensions of the house. She had her father's measuring tape in the bottom of her bag. She had carried it there for 3 years, a small inheritance from a man who had lived by precise measurement, who had believed that the accurate recording of physical reality was a form of respect for it. She moved through the house room by room, taking measurements of interior wall spans, comparing them to the dimensions on the 1921 drawings. The work was methodical and took most of 2 days and produced by its end a series of discrepancies that were too significant and too consistent to be explained by renovation or structural settling. The east wing ground floor was approximately 400 square feet smaller on the inside than the exterior dimensions of the building required. The exterior walls of the east wing were, she confirmed by multiple measurements from multiple angles, substantially thicker than any load-bearing requirement would demand. The space was not absent, It was hidden. It was behind the walls of the main study and the room adjacent to it that Dorothy had used as a reading room. Somewhere in the interior of the East Wing's eastern face, inaccessible from any door or window she had yet found. She began examining the study in detail. The eastern wall of the study was entirely occupied by a bookcase, a 10-foot section of built-in shelving that ran from floor to ceiling and was filled with reference volumes, architectural encyclopedias, sets of historical records, and the kind of serious secondary literature that accumulates in a serious reader's working library. The case was beautiful, constructed from the same dark oak as the paneling throughout the study, fitted with brass hardware, and backed with embossed leather panels. It looked as permanent as the wall itself. She spent a full hour running her hands along the edges of the shelving, feeling for seams and inconsistencies in the joinery. She pressed at the back panels. She examined the hardware brackets at the bottom of each vertical section. She found nothing. She was beginning to consider that she had miscalculated somewhere in her measurements when she kicked the edge of the Persian rug that ran the length of the eastern wall in frustration and revealed the hardwood floor beneath. The floor at the base of the central bookcase section was scuffed in a perfect semicircle. The marks were old, worn into the wood over many years of repetition, the unmistakable trace of a large piece of furniture that had been moved in a consistent arc again and again. She dropped to her knees and looked along the bottom shelf. It held a row of large format books, art references, and architectural atlases, their spines flush with the shelf edge. She read the titles. At the far left of the row was a volume labeled Structural Engineering of the Northeastern States, 1890 to 1920. She put her hand on the spine and pulled. It did not come off the shelf. It tilted forward with a sound that was partly mechanical and partly something older, the groan of a system that had been built to last and had. Somewhere inside the wall, beyond the paneling and the shelving and the stone of the house itself, a chain engaged. Gears that had been dormant for years shifted against each other. The entire central section of the bookcase, all 10 feet of it, disengaged from the wall with a sound like an exhalation and swung outward on hinges that were massive, industrial, and entirely invisible until the moment they revealed themselves. Cold air moved into the study from the darkness beyond. It carried the scent of something mineral and electrical, the smell of deep underground spaces and climate control systems running in the absence of human presence. Sloane reached for the brass flashlight on the desk, clicked it to its highest setting, and stepped through the opening. Behind the bookcase was a steel door. It was not the heavy aesthetic steel of a decorative safe, but the functional, purposeful steel of something designed to survive catastrophic events, a door that would still be standing when the house above it was not. It stood slightly ajar. Beside its frame was mounted a biometric fingerprint scanner, modern, installed long after the house was built, its indicator light glowing a patient amber in the dark. Below the scanner, set into the door at the original lock height, was a keyhole with a mechanism she recognized immediately. Star-shaped, the same as the brass key. She inserted the key. The tumblers engaged with the satisfying precision of something built to exact tolerances and maintained with care. She leaned her shoulder against the cold steel and pushed. The motion sensors triggered in sequence, fluorescent tubes humming to life down a long corridor, and then beyond it in a room so large she could not immediately see its far wall. She stood in the doorway for a moment before entering. The scale of what Dorothy had built beneath the Hargrove estate was not what she had expected, though she was not entirely sure what she had expected. This was not a hidden room. It was not a panic room or a wine cellar converted to unusual purpose. It was a facility. The ceiling was 8 feet high, poured concrete reinforced with steel I-beams. The floor was sealed concrete climate, controlled to a temperature she guessed at around 60 degrees, the kind of environment maintained not for human comfort, but for the preservation of documents. The air handling was audible, a low, constant movement that kept the humidity in the range where paper neither dries to brittleness nor absorbs enough moisture to support mold. The center of the room was occupied by rows of lateral filing cabinets, fireproof, the kind used by government archives and serious institutional collections. They ran in 6 rows of perhaps 15 cabinets each, all the same height, all the same institutional gray, all fitted with index card holders on the front of each drawer. Along the left wall were server racks, perhaps a dozen of them, their indicator lights blinking in slow rhythmic sequences, green and amber in the dark. The servers were running. Dorothy had arranged for them to remain powered and climate-controlled, presumably through Elliot Nash, presumably as part of the same careful advance planning that had shaped every other aspect of what she had left behind. Along the right wall was a desk. Mahogany the same as the one upstairs in the study, positioned facing the room rather than facing a window. The desk of a person who needed to see everything at once rather than to look away. The desk held surveillance monitors, dark now, and a paper shredder that had never been used, and a phone that Sloan would later identify as an encrypted satellite line. Positioned exactly in the center of the green leather blotter was a red accordion folder. It was thick, secured with a woven tie, and on its front face attached with a piece of cellophane tape that had yellowed slightly with age was a note in Dorothy's handwriting. For Sloan, when you are ready. She sat down in the leather chair behind the desk. She untied the folder. She opened it. She did not yet look inside. She looked instead at the filing cabinets, reading the labels on the visible drawer fronts from where she sat. The names were organized alphabetically. She could see from her position the drawer fronts of the first two rows. The names on them were familiar in the way that certain names become familiar when you have spent your life in a particular social and geographic world. Names that appear on the programs of fundraising galas and the donor walls of hospitals and the contribution lists of political campaigns. State senators, a sitting federal representative. The names of two men she recognized as prominent hedge fund managers with offices in Midtown Manhattan. The name of a real estate development firm from Fairfield County that had been in the local news for years, always on the edge of something that was never quite described clearly enough to constitute a story. She read the names with the same attention she had trained on Victor's study door in the years when she was still living in the house on Alderton Road. Then she began reading the red folder. The first document was a police report. Connecticut State Police incident dated 3 years prior, investigation file for the motor vehicle fatality on I-95 involving Thomas Hargrove. The version of the report she had seen before the public version, the version that closed the case, was 10 pages. The version in the folder was 42 pages, but approximately a third of its content had been redacted with thick black bars, and the redactions were not consistent with the logic of protecting witness identity or ongoing investigation. They were consistent with the logic of protecting specific names. She read the unredacted sections carefully. At the bottom of the cover page was the investigating officer's name, Lieutenant D. Whitson, Connecticut State Police, District 3. She took out her brown notebook. She wrote the name carefully. Then she wrote Prescott Whitson beneath it with a line connecting them and a question mark beside the line. She looked at the connection for a moment, and then she turned the page. Taken alone, the unredacted sections of the police report told her nothing she did not already know. But placed beside the second document in the folder, they told a different story entirely. The second document was a private forensic report prepared by an automotive specialist named Raymond Callister of Callister Technical Services in Providence, Rhode Island, dated 14 months after the accident. Dorothy had retained him through a separate legal entity to ensure that the engagement could not be traced back to her directly. The report was 40 pages technical in its language, careful in its methodology, and unambiguous in its conclusion. She read the conclusion section first, as she had learned to do with technical documents in the public library on Broad Street. The conclusion stated that the brake failure in the subject vehicle was not consistent with mechanical wear manufacturing defect or ordinary thermal degradation. It stated that analysis of the recovered brake line fragments indicated the presence of a localized chemical degradation consistent with exposure to a corrosive agent with a specific thermal activation threshold, meaning that the compound would remain inert at normal operating temperatures and would begin to aggressively compromise the brake housing only when the fluid reached the elevated temperatures that occur during extended or repeated braking. On a highway drive from New Haven to Greenwich, with the traffic conditions and route characteristics present on the evening in question, the thermal threshold would have been reached approximately 40 to 50 minutes into the drive, placing the moment of failure precisely where it had occurred on the descent of a long grade on the I-95 corridor, exactly the section of road where repeated braking at speed would have accelerated the degradation to its critical point. Thomas Hargrove had not suffered a cardiac event. He had braked on a familiar stretch of highway and found that the brakes were no longer there. Sloan set the report down on the blotter. She set it down with the same careful deliberateness with which she had once set down a payphone receiver in a convenience store doorway in January. She looked at the wall across from the desk for a moment. The fluorescent lights hummed their patient, indifferent hum. The server rack lights blinked their slow green sequences. She picked the report back up and continued reading. The third document was a series of printed email exchanges. They had been printed from a screen, not forwarded from a server, which meant Dorothy had obtained visual access to the account rather than technical access. The emails were between two addresses. One was a personal Gmail account registered to a username she did not initially recognize, but which would become clear as she read. The other was a business email at the domain of Northeast Capital Bank. She recognized the domain before she recognized the name. Prescott Whitson, Vice President of Commercial Lending, Northeast Capital Bank. The name she had written in her brown leather notebook 3 years ago, copied from a business card on Victor Kane's desk. The emails were dated across a period beginning approximately 18 months before Thomas died and continuing for 7 months after. They discussed in the clipped and plausibly deniable language of people who know they are doing something that cannot be stated plainly, the administration of a series of loan default notifications to a commercial architecture firm. The emails referenced specific account numbers. They referenced timing, the sequence in which the notifications would be issued to create maximum disruption with minimum legal exposure. They discussed the structure of a corporate vehicle that would serve as the recipient of redirected assets. The corporate vehicle was referred to in the emails by its initials. AM. Apex Meridian. Victor had built the mechanism before Thomas died. Then he had used Prescott Whitson to trigger the mechanism. Then Thomas had gone off the I-95 guardrail on a Tuesday evening in October with failed brakes and died before he could respond to the notifications or trace their origin or do anything at all. The fourth document was a bank statement. Cayman Islands, a financial institution she did not recognize. The account holder was listed as a trust, not an individual, but the trust's name was a sequence of numbers that corresponded, as she would later confirm with Elliot Nash, to a Delaware incorporation number that traced back to Victor Kane through two intermediary entities. The transfers into the account began in the month Thomas died and continued in regular intervals for the following 4 years. The amounts were consistent with the systematic depletion of the Hargrove family trust. Her father's careful savings dismantled from the inside over 48 months and moved offshore through a chain of corporate entities that had been built for exactly this purpose. She was sitting in the most quiet room she had ever occupied in her life, reading the story of how everything she had ever been given was taken from her, not by accident, not by circumstance, by construction, by the patience and premeditation of a man who had entered her family's life wearing the face of a benefactor. The fifth document was in a smaller interior pocket of the accordion folder folded in half. When she unfolded it, a small velvet box fell out and landed on the blotter. She did not open the box immediately. She read the document first. It was a chain of custody note in Dorothy's handwriting, 3 paragraphs attesting to the recovery of the enclosed item from a personal property box in the custody of the Hartford Medical Examiner's Office, obtained through a legal records request 14 months after Thomas died. The note stated that the item had been listed in the original inventory of personal effects recovered from the crash site and had subsequently been removed from the evidence inventory before the property was returned to next of kin. Dorothy had obtained a copy of the original inventory through a Freedom of Information request and had identified the discrepancy. She had then retained a paralegal to formally request the missing item. The medical examiner's office had, apparently without recognizing the significance of the request, simply returned it. Sloane opened the velvet box. Her father's signet ring, silver old, slightly tarnished in the grooves of the engraved crest. The exact weight of it, the exact cool smoothness of the metal under her fingertip was so precisely what she remembered from the earliest years of her childhood that the sensation was less like recognition and more like time collapsing all the years between her small fingers on that ring and this moment in this underground room compressing into a single unbearable instant. She put the ring on her right hand. It was too large. She curled her fingers to keep it in place. She climbed back up the concrete staircase when she was finally ready and swung the bookcase closed behind her and stood again in the study with its garden windows gone fully dark. She did not turn on more lights than the single lamp on the desk. She did not eat. She sat in the chair that had been her father's aunt's and held the ring he had worn every day of her childhood, and she allowed the full weight of what she now knew to settle into her, the way cold settles into stone completely, and permanently, and without asking permission. When she finally went to bed, it was past midnight. She slept 6 hours without dreaming, which was the most her body had allowed her in longer than she could accurately remember. She was in the middle of her second cup of coffee the following morning when she heard the car on the gravel of the main drive. She went to the parlor window. A black Mercedes SUV, current model year, very clean, despite the November roads, was pulling up to the front of the house. It stopped at the base of the porch steps. The driver's door opened and Victor Kane stepped out. He was wearing the camel overcoat. He stood beside the car and looked at the facade of the house with an expression she recognized, the expression of a person calculating the value of something they believe they have a claim on. Then the passenger door opened and Margaret got out. Margaret looked thinner than Sloane remembered. She was wearing a dark wool coat and her hair was the same shade of well-maintained blonde, but something in her posture had changed in 3 years. A slight curve inward at the shoulders that had not been there before. She stood beside the car and looked up at the house with an expression that was harder to read, something between hunger and anxiety, and something else that Sloane filed carefully away for later consideration. She put down her coffee cup. She opened the front door before they reached the top of the porch steps. She did not say hello. She did not invite them in. She stood in the doorway with one hand on the door and waited. Margaret stopped at the top of the porch steps and brought a hand to her chest. She said Sloane's name with an emphasis that was meant to convey profound maternal relief and managed instead to convey the effort of conveying profound maternal relief. Victor came up the steps behind her and arranged his face into the expression of measured reasonableness that Sloane had watched him deploy across dozens of situations in the years she had lived in his house. He said, in the tone of a man who has considered the approach carefully on a 4-hour drive, that they had been concerned, that they had tried to reach her, that family was family regardless of past difficulties. Sloane looked at him without expression. He said that an estate of this scale was a significant undertaking for a young woman on her own. He said that the grounds alone required experienced management. He said that Dorothy, toward the end of her life, had not been entirely clear in her intentions, which was a sentence that required a certain audacity to say in the doorway of a house that had just been legally and unambiguously transferred to the person he was saying it to. He said that he was prepared to offer his services in a purely advisory capacity, no compensation required, simply as a member of the family looking out for the family's best interests. He gestured at the facade of the house behind her, at the neglected porch railing, and the weathered pane at the evidence of years of minimal maintenance. He gestured as a man gestures at something he already considers his. Sloane said, you should know that Elliot Nash has a war chest. Dorothy established it specifically for legal challenges arising from this estate. It is substantial and it is dedicated, and his firm has been waiting 3 years to use it. Victor's face did not change completely, but the quality of his expression shifted in a way that was almost microscopic and entirely legible to someone who had spent years studying it. The reasonableness thinned. Beneath it was something colder and more accurate to his actual character. He said she should think carefully before making decisions based on the advice of a lawyer whose loyalties were to a dead woman's grudges rather than to the living family members who had her best interests at heart. Sloane said, get off my property. Both of you. If you come back without an appointment made through Elliot Nash's office, I will call the sheriff's department and have you removed for trespassing. This is not a negotiation. This is a statement of what will happen. Margaret said her name again. This time the emphasis was different. This time it was not performance. This time it was something smaller and more genuine that Sloane set beside the expression in the driveway. The anxiety beneath the hunger, the thing that did not fit cleanly into the simple architecture of complicity. Victor put his hand on Margaret's arm and guided her back down the porch steps with the smooth efficiency of a man who knows when to retreat and when to regroup. They got back into the Mercedes. He did not look at Sloane again as he turned the car around in the drive. Margaret looked at her through the passenger window as they passed. It was a brief look, unguarded in the way that looks through glass sometimes are, and what it contained was not the cold calculation of a co-conspirator. It was the look of a person who has been living inside a choice they made years ago and has discovered too late and too completely that the choice has become a room with no door. The car disappeared down the gravel lane between the Norway spruces. Sloane stood on the porch for a moment after the sound of the engine faded. Then she went back inside. She spent the rest of the morning in the study on the second floor, the smaller personal study that had been Dorothy's private writing room rather than her formal working space. It was the room where Dorothy had kept her personal correspondence organized in archival boxes on the shelving along the north wall. Sloane had been working through the boxes, systematically reading not for specific information, but for context, building her understanding of who Dorothy had been and how she had lived and thought. In the third box from the end of the bottom shelf, beneath a collection of correspondence from the 1990s, she found an envelope that was different from the others. It was sealed, but the seal had been broken and re-glued carefully, but not quite successfully, the kind of envelope someone has opened and then reconsidered. On the front, in handwriting she did not immediately recognize, was a single name: Dorothy. She opened it. The letter was from Margaret. It was dated 4 years ago, 3 months before Thomas died. Margaret's handwriting was the careful, slightly ornamented cursive of a woman who had been taught penmanship as a matter of discipline and had maintained the habit. The letter was 2 pages written on personal stationery she recognized from the house on Alderton Road, pale blue, with a small engraved initial at the top. She read it twice. Margaret wrote to Dorothy without preamble or apology, which suggested she understood that neither was warranted. She wrote that she was frightened. Not of Victor directly, not yet, but of the way the financial landscape of her household had shifted in the years since Thomas died. Shifts she could trace but not entirely understand, movements of money through accounts she had nominally signed for but did not control. She wrote that she was frightened of her own silence, of having said nothing for too long about things she had noticed and not questioned. She wrote that she was frightened for Sloane, her daughter, in a way she found difficult to put plainly, but which had to do with the trust and with the documents Victor had asked her to sign, and with the growing understanding that her signature on those documents was not a formality, but something more essential to a plan she had not been shown in full. She wrote that she was telling Dorothy this because she could not tell anyone else, and because Dorothy had always been, in Margaret's private estimation, the most honest person she had ever known, which was why she had not stayed close to her after Thomas died, because Dorothy's honesty had felt in the early years of her relationship with Victor like something she needed to keep at a distance. She wrote that she was not asking for anything. She wrote that she did not know what asking would even look like. She wrote that she was writing the letter because writing it felt like the only available form of witness to what she feared was becoming, and that she did not know if she would send it. She had not sent it. It was here in Dorothy's possession, which meant Dorothy had reached out to her first, or which meant Margaret had ultimately sent it, and Dorothy had kept it deliberately in this particular place, in this particular box, where it would be found in this particular sequence by the person for whom it was ultimately intended. The letter did not change what Margaret had done. It did not change the notarial seal on the Emancipation Papers, or the 3 years in Bridgeport, or the payphone in January, or the voice that said, "I cannot do this," and disconnected. It did not change any of the weight of those things, but it changed their shape. It changed Margaret from a flat and simple co-conspirator into a more complicated and more human failure, a person who had seen something true and had been afraid of it and had chosen the wrong shelter and had ended up somewhere far darker than the fear she had been running from. Sloane recognized, looking at the letter, that this information would eventually matter in some way she could not yet specify. She filed it in the place she kept things whose significance was clear, but whose application was not yet ready. She put the letter back in the envelope. She put it in the interior pocket of her jacket against her chest. That evening, she called Elliot Nash from the encrypted satellite phone in the bunker. She told him about the red folder. She told him about the forensic report and the emails and the Cayman account and the ring. She told him what she had read and what it meant. She told him about Victor and Margaret's visit. She told him about the name at the bottom of the police report's cover page, Lieutenant D. Whitson, and the line she had drawn in her notebook connecting it to Prescott Whitson at Northeast Capital Bank. Nash was quiet for a longer moment than usual when she mentioned that detail. Then he said he would look into the connection independently before their next meeting. Her voice was measured throughout the call, the voice of someone reporting facts rather than experiencing them, which was not quite true, but was the most useful approximation available to her. Nash said that Dorothy's file was consistent with what his firm had suspected, but not yet been able to prove through independently verifiable means. He said that the automotive forensic report was the piece they had been most in need of because it was the piece that moved the legal situation from financial crime to something that required federal involvement. He said that Sloane should not contact the FBI directly yet. He said they needed to build the sequence carefully. Evidence prepared in the correct format, witnesses identified and secured, so that when the case was presented, it could not be dismantled by the resources Victor would bring to its dismantling. He said to sit tight. He said to make no moves that would indicate to Victor that she had found anything more than financial records. He said to let Victor believe his visit had unsettled her. She said she understood. She said goodnight and replaced the receiver. She sat in the chair behind Dorothy's desk in the underground room for a while longer. The server lights blinked their slow green rhythm. The air handling moved its quiet, continuous circulation. She had spent 3 years building patience in a room above an auto repair shop in Bridgeport, and the patience was now an instrument she could use rather than simply a condition she was enduring. She was not ready yet, but she could see the shape of readiness from where she sat. It was 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday night at 2 in the morning, that the phone rang. Not the encrypted satellite line. The landline in the main kitchen, whose number was not publicly listed and had not been changed since Dorothy's time. She had let it go to the answering machine twice before both calls from local services that had found the listing in old directories. This time she was awake, unable to sleep, reading at the kitchen table with the lights low. She picked it up. The voice on the other end was young male and frightened in a way that was different from performed anxiety. This was the genuine thing, a person calling from somewhere that required whispers, calling a number they had clearly needed to find through some effort, calling at 2 in the morning, because 2 in the morning was the only time the architecture of their daily life left space for a call like this. He said her name. Then he said his own. Brett Kane. She did not say anything. She waited. He spoke in short, clipped sentences, the syntax of someone who has rehearsed what they need to say, but is finding the rehearsal insufficient for the actual moment of saying it. He said that he had known about his father and Thomas Hargrove since he was 15 years old. He said that his father had told him, not as a confession, not as a burden shared, as a demonstration, the way certain men demonstrate power to their sons by showing them what they are capable of. He said it had taken him 7 years to sleep through a full night after that conversation. He said he had been trying to find a version of himself that could do something about it for almost as long. He said he had something. His voice dropped further when he said this, the drop of someone naming a thing that has been dangerous to hold. He said that 6 years ago, when he was still living part of the year with his father in Hartford, he had found an old cell phone in the discard pile his father kept in his home office, the pile of outdated devices that accumulated before the biannual decision to take them to the electronics recycler. He had taken the phone before it reached the recycler. He had not been entirely sure why. Some instinct perhaps related to having been told what he had been told, the instinct of a person who understands that proximity to certain kinds of men requires the maintenance of leverage. The phone had contained, among other things, a voice recording. His father's phone had been set to automatically record calls made from a particular contact, a practice Victor apparently used for certain business relationships as a form of insurance. The recording was of a conversation between Victor Kane and a man his father addressed as Prescott. The conversation was about timing. It was about the brake lines. It was about the account into which the first transfer needed to land before the accident because the sequencing mattered for the legal insulation. It was 7 minutes and 43 seconds long, and it was still on the phone, which Brett Kane had kept in a waterproof bag inside a locked box inside a storage unit in Wethersfield, Connecticut, for 6 years while he tried to find the courage to decide what to do with it. He said he was ready to turn it over. He said he needed to know that doing so would not leave him exposed to criminal liability for concealing it, and he needed to know that his name would not be part of any public proceeding in a way that put him in proximity to his father's resources and his father's anger. He said he knew that asking for anything in exchange for evidence of a murder made him something he was not proud of being. He said that he was asking anyway because the alternative was continuing to be what he already was, which was a person who knew what had happened to her father and had not done anything about it. She held the phone against her ear for a moment in the quiet kitchen of Hargrove Estate in the dark of a November night in the Hudson Valley, with the river somewhere beyond the tree line, and her father's ring on her right hand too large, held in place by the curled pressure of her fingers. She told him to call Elliot Nash in the morning. She told him what to say when Nash answered. She told him to go nowhere that was not a public space until he had spoken with Nash and arrangements had been made. She told him she would make sure he was protected. When she hung up, she sat for a moment with her hand still on the phone. Then she opened her brown leather notebook to the next blank page and began to write. She wrote Brett Kane at the top. She wrote Storage Unit Wethersfield. She wrote Voice Recording 7 minutes 43 seconds. She wrote Prescott Whitson. She wrote the name she had written many times before and whose meaning had expanded each time she wrote it until it was now something close to the full and true name of what had been done to her father and to her and to the house on Alderton Road and to the version of her life that should have existed and did not. Victor Kane. She drew a line beneath the name. She looked at the line for a moment. Then she turned to a fresh page and began to write the first notes of what would eventually become a plan. The plan took 3 months to build, and Sloan built it the way her father had built buildings, from the foundation up each layer dependent on the integrity of the one beneath it. Nothing decorative added until the load-bearing structure was sound. She worked from the bunker in the mornings, from the study upstairs in the afternoons, and from the kitchen table at night when she could not sleep, which was often. The brown leather notebook filled, and she started a third. Elliot Nash drove up from Boston twice to review the documentation sequencing. Brett Kane met with Nash's firm in a Hartford hotel conference room on a Thursday morning and handed over the waterproof bag from the storage unit in Wethersfield, and Nash's paralegal spent 4 days extracting and authenticating the audio files from the recovered phone while Brett stayed at a motel in Providence under a name Nash's office had arranged. The recording was 7 minutes and 43 seconds of two men discussing the death of Thomas Hargrove in the language of logistics, and it was exactly what it needed to be. The approach to Prescott Whitson was Sloan's decision, not Nash's. Nash had recommended allowing the FBI to make first contact the procedurally cleaner approach, the one that kept her at a remove from the negotiation and reduced any possibility that Whitson's lawyers could later characterize the arrangement as coercive. Sloan understood the logic and overruled it. She told Nash that she had been watching Whitson's public financial disclosures for the past 2 months, and that what she saw there was a man whose relationship with Victor Kane had been deteriorating for some time. A man who had done something irreversible on another man's instruction and was now discovering that the protection he had been promised was not materializing with the consistency he had been led to expect. She said she wanted to have the conversation herself. She said that Whitson needed to understand from the person most directly harmed by what he had done that the choice in front of him was not between loyalty to Victor and disloyalty to Victor. The choice was between controlled accountability and uncontrolled catastrophe. Nash looked at her across the kitchen table of Hargrove Estate with the expression of a man revising an estimate upward. He said he would need to be present at the meeting. She said that was acceptable. She said she would do the talking. She called Whitson's direct line at Northeast Capital Bank on a Wednesday morning. His assistant answered, and she gave her name and said she was calling regarding a personal matter of significant urgency concerning his professional conduct, and that she was prepared to involve federal authorities within 48 hours if a meeting could not be arranged sooner. The assistant put her on hold for 4 minutes. Whitson came on the line. His voice was controlled and professionally neutral, the voice of a man who had been trained to handle difficult conversations by not revealing that they were difficult. She told him she had the emails. She told him she had the Apex Meridian Incorporation documents. She told him she had the Cayman account statements. She did not tell him about the recording. She let the silence after the last item do its work. He asked how she had obtained these materials. She said that was not the relevant question and that he likely already knew the answer. She said the relevant question was whether he wanted to be the person who had been used by Victor Kane and ultimately discarded by him, or whether he wanted to be the person who helped the federal government understand the full scope of what Victor Kane had built. She said that the first option resulted in a trial in which he was the most prosecutable individual because he was the most visible one, the man whose actual name was on the bank correspondence, the man without the protective layers of shell companies and intermediary entities that Victor had wrapped around himself. She said the second option was uncomfortable and required courage, but that the outcome was substantially different. She gave him 24 hours to consult with a personal attorney, not the bank's general counsel, a personal attorney of his own choosing, and to call Nash and Associates with his decision. He called the following morning at 9:15. He said he needed assurances about the scope of federal cooperation and about the protection of his family from any civil actions Victor might bring. Nash handled the assurance conversation. By noon, Whitson had agreed in principle. By the end of the week, he had met once with Nash and once in a conference room in New Haven with two agents from the FBI Financial Crimes Unit who had been briefed by Nash the previous day and who arrived with a familiarity with the Apex Meridian structure that told Sloan the Bureau had been building its own file perhaps for some time and had been waiting for the piece that would allow the financial crime to connect to something more serious. The something more serious was Raymond Callister's forensic report combined with the audio recording. When Nash presented both items to the lead agent, a woman named Sandra Foley, who had the patient intensity of someone who had spent a career working cases that moved slowly and required the tolerance of ambiguity, Foley looked at the materials for a long time before she looked up. Then she asked Sloan directly whether she understood what she was presenting and whether she understood what the investigation would require of her in terms of cooperation and testimony. Sloan said yes to both questions. Foley said the Bureau would need 6 weeks to prepare the evidentiary package and coordinate with the Connecticut U.S. Attorney's Office. She said that during those 6 weeks, nothing should change in Victor Kane's observable environment. He should not be tipped. He should not be approached. He should continue to believe that his lawsuit to contest the estate was proceeding on its normal timeline. Sloan said that was exactly what she intended. Victor had filed the civil suit 4 weeks after his visit to the estate, exactly as she had expected. The suit claimed that Dorothy Hargrove had been of diminished mental capacity in the final 18 months of her life, and that the terms of the will therefore reflected coercive influence rather than genuine testamentary intent. It was a suit that had almost no legal merit but considerable nuisance value, the kind of action that a well-resourced party can use to delay and exhaust an opponent of lesser means. Victor did not know about the war chest. He did not know that Dorothy had anticipated this suit and had prepared a specific and substantial legal fund for its defeat. He did not know that Nash and Associates had been waiting for this filing the way a shortstop waits for a ball hit to the exact spot he has been covering for his entire career. More importantly, Victor did not know that the suit required a formal mediation session before it could proceed to trial, and that he had just arranged through his own legal strategy for a mandatory meeting in a room where federal agents would be parked outside in vehicles that blended perfectly with the ordinary traffic of a Hartford business district. The mediation was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in February at 9 o'clock in a conference suite on the 14th floor of the building that housed Kane and Associates. Victor had chosen the location. The choice communicated something about how he understood the proceedings as a performance of his own authority, a theatrical staging designed to convey that he occupied the center of this dispute and that Sloan was coming to him. Sloan understood the choice and found it useful. It meant that when the day arrived, the dismantling of his authority would occur in the room he believed was most fully his. She drove from Rhinebeck to Hartford alone the morning of the mediation. She left at 6 while the river valley was still dark, the Hudson invisible below the bridge, but present as a sound and a pressure, the weight of cold-moving water. She drove south through the river towns in the early light past the ice-edged fields and the bare-limbed orchards, and she felt in the stillness of that drive something she recognized as the final consolidation of a long preparation. The 3 years in Bridgeport, the notebooks, the library on Broad Street, the bunker beneath the estate, the call from Brett at 2 in the morning. Each of these things had been in its own way a stair and a staircase that had led here to this morning, to this drive to the 14th floor of a building in Hartford where a man who had killed her father would sit down across a table from her for the last time. She parked in the public garage 2 blocks from the building. She sat in the Jeep for a moment. She was wearing her father's ring on her right hand, the silver signet ring from the velvet box in the bunker, and she had adjusted it before leaving the estate that morning with a thin strip of tape wrapped around the inside of the band to make it fit. She turned her hand over and looked at it in the gray February light. The engraved crest was clear in the low light. She had looked up the family crest in the estate library in January and had learned that the Hargrove device dated to the early 19th century and incorporated among its other elements a compass. Rose, the traditional symbol of an architect, of a person who establishes orientation in space so that others can know where they are. She got out of the Jeep and walked to the building. The conference suite on the 14th floor was larger than necessary for its stated purpose, which was itself a deliberate choice. Victor was already in the room when she arrived, seated at the far end of the conference table with 3 lawyers arranged beside and behind him, their folders open, their expressions collectively calibrated to convey the comfortable assurance of people with considerable procedural experience. Victor himself was in a dark suit, the camel coat folded over the chair beside him, and he looked exactly as he had always looked, measured and authoritative and faintly pleasant, in the way of men who have learned that pleasantness is a component of dominance rather than its opposite. He glanced at her when she entered, and then returned his attention to a document in front of him, a small theater of indifference. She had arrived alone. Nash came in 2 minutes behind her carrying 2 briefcases, which was one more than he usually carried. He set them on the table beside Sloan and sat down. He did not open either of them immediately. The mediator was a retired state court judge named Harold Ferris, brought in by mutual agreement. He began the session with the standard procedural outline, the nature of the dispute, the goal of mediation as an alternative to trial, the expectation of good faith engagement from both parties. He had the measured tone of a man who had done this hundreds of times and had long since stopped believing that either party arrived in good faith, but who understood that the procedural frame was the necessary container for whatever actually needed to happen. Victor's lead attorney spoke first. She was a woman in her 50s with the brisk efficiency of someone who billed at rates that precluded circumlocution. She presented the claim concisely. Dorothy Hargrove had exhibited documented signs of cognitive decline in her final 2 years as attested by sworn affidavits from 2 individuals who had interacted with her during that period. The will under these circumstances was an instrument produced under compromised capacity and was therefore subject to challenge. She concluded by noting that the family, specifically Margaret Hargrove Kane, as Dorothy's closest surviving blood relative on the maternal line, had a legitimate claim to equitable distribution of the estate's assets. She said this last part without inflection, and Sloan recognized the precision of it. Margaret's blood relationship to Dorothy was technically accurate. It was also technically the first time Victor had explicitly used Margaret's name as a legal vehicle for his claim, which meant that if Margaret had not been fully aware of the scope of what was being done in her name before this morning, she was aware of it now. Sloane looked at Margaret, who was seated to Victor's left, slightly behind him, not quite at the table occupying the position of a person who is present but peripheral. Margaret was looking at her hands. Nash said that he would like to begin with a few documents before responding to the capacity claim. He said this with the calm of a person who has already decided the order of events and is simply announcing it. He opened the first briefcase. The first set of documents was the financial records, wire transfers, Apex Meridian account statements, the Delaware Incorporation filing the Cayman account statements cross-referenced against the trust depletion timeline. Nash laid them in the center of the table without commentary and let them sit. Victor's lead attorney picked up the top page and looked at it. She set it down. Her face gave away nothing. Victor looked at the pages from his position and did not reach for them. He said, with the dismissive assurance of a man performing dismissiveness, that these documents were fabricated, that they represented a collage of selectively edited financial data, combined with forgeries of unknown origin, and that his attorneys would be filing a motion to examine the chain of custody of any such materials before they were admitted into any formal proceeding. The mediator noted the objection for the record. Nash opened the second briefcase. He produced the automotive forensic report. He produced the chain of custody documentation for the brake line fragments analyzed by Raymond Callister. He produced Callister's professional credentials and the methodology section of the report. He laid these on the table in sequence, each item following the previous, with the unhurried rhythm of someone building something that will stand. Then he placed at the end of the sequence a single printed transcript. He placed it face down. He said, what I am about to present is a transcript of an audio recording. The original recording is currently in the custody of the Federal Bureau of Investigation Financial Crimes Unit, Hartford Field Office. It has been authenticated by 2 independent audio forensic specialists retained by the Bureau. I am going to play a portion of it now. He reached into the second briefcase and produced a small Bluetooth speaker, which he set at the center of the table. He connected it to his phone. He looked at Victor. He said, I want to give you the opportunity to ask your attorneys to leave the room before I play this. The attorneys are not the subject of this recording. They may find that remaining in the room creates a conflict of interest for them professionally. 2 of the 3 attorneys looked at each other. The lead attorney looked at Victor. Victor's face had undergone in the past 40 seconds a series of small revisions. The pleasantness had retracted. The dismissiveness had thinned. What remained was a set of controlled muscles performing control the effort visible now, where it had not been before, a man holding an expression in place through will rather than habit. He told his attorneys to stay. Nash pressed play. The recording quality was the practical quality of a phone call captured on a device not designed for recording, clear enough for comprehension, ambient enough to carry the incidental sounds of 2 men talking on a phone in whatever spaces they occupied on that afternoon more than 6 years ago. Victor's voice was immediately recognizable, the measured cadence, the slight Hartford flatness in his vowels. Prescott Whitson's voice was higher, less certain, carrying even then the anxious undertow of a man doing something he understood was not recoverable. The conversation was 7 minutes and 43 seconds long, and Nash played all of it. In the conference suite on the 14th floor, nobody spoke. One of the attorneys set his pen down on the table approximately 90 seconds into the recording and did not pick it up again. The mediator, Harold Ferris, stopped writing in his notes at the 2-minute mark and simply listened with the expression of a man who has been retired from the bench for 4 years and has just been reminded in the most direct way possible of why the work he did mattered. The recording ended, the small speaker emitted a brief silence, and then Nash tapped his phone, and the silence became the sound of the room itself, the HVAC, the faint traffic from the street 14 floors below. Margaret said Victor's name. She said it quietly in the voice of the letter Sloane had found in Dorothy's archive, the letter that had not been sent, the voice beneath the performance. She said, "What did you do?" Victor turned to her. The turn was controlled. He said nothing. Margaret said it again, and this time it was not a question. Her voice did not rise. It had instead the quality of something settling finally into place. The sound of a person arriving at the end of a long distance they had been traveling without knowing they were traveling. It putting down weight they had been carrying so long they had stopped registering it as weight. Victor's lead attorney said in the clipped and now slightly altered voice of a professional, rapidly recalculating a professional situation, that she needed to advise her client not to respond to anything at this time and that she was requesting a recess. The mediator said that a recess would be granted. Nash said there was one more item before the recess. He looked at Sloan. She reached into the leather portfolio she had carried into the room and produced a single document which she placed on the table. She said that 6 months before her death, Dorothy Eleanor Hargrove had transferred a complete digital copy of the archive, currently housed beneath the Hargrove estate, to the United States Department of Justice, delivered through an escrow arrangement managed by a Washington, D.C. law firm and triggered automatically upon Dorothy's death. She said the DOJ had received those materials 5 months ago. She said the FBI investigation currently underway was not the result of this morning's mediation. It had been underway before Victor filed his civil suit. It had been underway in a preliminary form for longer than that. She said that every statement Victor had made in this room this morning had been made in the knowledge by the federal agents who had reviewed the briefing materials that those statements might constitute additional evidence of consciousness of guilt. She said she was not a lawyer and was not offering a legal interpretation. She was simply describing the situation as it existed. She folded her hands on the table. She looked at Victor directly. She said this room is the last room in which you have any choice remaining. Everything after this room is determined by the evidence. The only variable left is whether you use whatever time you have between now and what comes next to make arrangements that reflect some acknowledgement of what you did, or whether you spend it performing a defense that will not succeed and that will require the people who work for you and the people who have built professional relationships with you to testify against you in open court. She said, I am not offering you anything. I have nothing to offer you, and I would not offer it if I did. I am telling you the truth of your situation because my father believed that the accurate presentation of reality was a form of respect for the person receiving it, even when that person did not deserve the respect. The room was very quiet for a moment. Then the conference suite door opened and Sandra Foley walked in with 3 other agents. They were carrying credentials and they did not sit down. Foley said Victor Kane's full name. She said he was under arrest for federal wire fraud conspiracy to commit financial fraud and conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree in the death of Thomas Elliott Hargrove. She said he had the right to remain silent. She said it with the professional precision of a person who has waited a considerable time to say exactly these words in exactly this context and has decided that professional precision is the appropriate register for the occasion. Victor stood. He was very still for a moment. He looked at Sloan across the conference table with an expression that passed through several phases in quick succession. The residual performance of composure beneath that, the cold assessment of a man calculating final options and finding none. And beneath that, something rawer and more honest than anything she had seen on his face in the years she had lived in his house and watched him perform for audiences who could not see what she saw. It was the expression of a man who built carefully and at length and with considerable intelligence, and who was standing in the moment of understanding that the foundation was not what he believed it to be. He did not speak. He turned away from her and extended his wrists, and the handcuffs engaged with the small, decisive sound of a mechanism closing. They led him past the window wall with its view of the Hartford skyline in the gray February light, past the mediator's table, and the attorneys who were already on their phones, past Margaret, who did not look at him as he passed. He did not look back. After the agents and Victor and the lawyers had cleared the room, there was a silence in the conference suite that had a different quality from the silence that had preceded the recording. This silence was not charged. It was resolved. It was the silence after something that has been in motion for a long time finally comes to rest. Margaret was still seated in her chair, slightly behind and to the left of where Victor had been sitting. She was looking at the surface of the conference table. Her hands were in her lap, and her posture had changed again, The inward curve at the shoulders, more pronounced now, the structure of a person who has had several things removed simultaneously and has not yet found a new equilibrium. She looked for the first time in Sloane's memory, not like a woman managing an impression, but simply like a person specific and tired and present in her body, in the ungainly way that genuine emotion produces. Sloane told Nash to wait for her in the lobby. He took both briefcases and left without comment. She walked around the table and stood before her mother. She did not sit down. She looked at Margaret for a moment, this woman she had called every day as a small child. This woman whose voice she had heard on a payphone in January saying, "I cannot do this." This woman whose handwriting she had read by the light of a reading lamp in an archive in a room beneath a house in the Hudson Valley. Margaret looked up. Her eyes were red at the rims. She said Sloane's name in the voice from the letter the voice beneath the performance. Sloane reached into the interior pocket of her jacket and produced the envelope. She set it on the table in front of Margaret. It was the letter the one Margaret had written to Dorothy 4 years ago, and either sent or not sent the one that had arrived in Dorothy's archive and been kept in a specific box in a specific place where it would be found in sequence. Margaret looked at the envelope. Her expression changed when she recognized her own handwriting on the front. Sloane said Dorothy kept this. I think she kept it where I would find it because she understood something about you that she wanted me to understand before this morning. She paused. She looked at her mother carefully, the way she had looked at things her entire adult life, with the precise attention of someone recording what is actually present rather than what they need to be present. She said the letter does not change what happened. It does not change the Emancipation Papers, or the 3 years in Bridgeport, or the night in January when you hung up the phone. Those things are not changeable. I am not standing here to offer you absolution, because absolution is not mine to offer, and it is not what you need. What you need is to live with the accurate knowledge of what you chose and what it cost. She said, I know you were afraid of him. I know that fear is real and that it compounds over time in ways that make the original choice feel like the only choice, and then make every subsequent choice feel like there was never any other option. I know this does not make you a simple person or a purely culpable one. She said, but you are my mother, and a mother protects her child. That is not a complicated standard. That is the one thing that should not have been negotiable. She let that sit for a moment. Then she said the federal investigation will require your cooperation. Nash's office will be in contact with your attorney about the scope of what is expected. If you cooperate fully and truthfully, the U.S. attorney will likely decline to pursue charges against you directly, though the civil consequences of your marital assets being seized will be significant. You will need to make practical arrangements. Nash can refer you to someone who handles that. She said this not with coldness, but with the efficiency of a person who has thought through the practical landscape and is presenting it accurately. It was, she recognized as she said it, the same quality her father had brought to the presentation of difficult facts, the belief that clarity was a form of care, even when its content was painful. She picked up the leather portfolio from the table. She said, I hope eventually that you find a life that belongs to you. I genuinely hope that. But I cannot be part of how you find it. Not now and perhaps not ever. She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. She did not turn around. She said, the letter is yours. Dorothy would have wanted you to have it back. Then she walked out. The elevator was empty. She rode it down 14 floors in silence, watching the numbers descend on the small display above the doors. In the lobby, Nash was standing near the entrance with both briefcases talking to Sandra Foley, who appeared to be wrapping up a brief and businesslike conversation. Foley saw Sloane and gave her a small nod as she passed the nod of a professional, acknowledging completed work, and walked toward the building's side entrance, where a black vehicle was waiting. Sloane walked out into the February morning. The Hartford street was ordinary and cold, the pavement wet from an overnight mist, the kind of overcast February sky that is not dramatic in any way, but simply present, gray and unhurried, and indifferent to what has just occurred on the 14th floor of the building behind her. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment. She could see her breath. She was wearing her father's ring on her right hand, held in place by the folded tape, and she pressed her fingers together to feel its weight. Nash came up beside her. He said that Foley had confirmed the arrest processing would likely be completed by evening, and that the arraignment was scheduled for Thursday. He said the Connecticut U.S. attorney had been briefed and that the federal charges would be filed jointly with the state-level charges related to Thomas Hargrove's death. He said that based on the evidentiary package and Whitson's cooperation agreement and the audio recording, the prosecution's position was strong. He said that it was not a certainty that nothing in federal proceedings was a certainty, but that the evidentiary foundation was as sound as anything he had seen in 30 years of practice. She said what happens to Whitson. Nash said the cooperation agreement included a suspended sentence and civil fines. He said Whitson would lose his banking license and would likely spend the remainder of his professional life in a significantly reduced capacity, but that he would not go to prison. He said that was the cost of the cooperation and that the information and testimony Whitson had provided was worth the cost. She nodded. She said in Brett. Nash said that Brett Kane's cooperation as a material witness had been formally acknowledged by the Bureau and that his name would not appear in any public filing unless he chose to provide additional testimony at trial, which was his right but not his obligation. He said Brett had already left Providence and that Nash's office had lost track of his location, which was, Nash said with a slight dryness, likely intentional on Brett's part. She thought about Brett for a moment. He had carried that phone for 6 years, which was its own kind of sentence. She hoped the weight of it had lifted when he handed it over. She hoped whatever he was doing now, in whatever city Nash's office had lost track of him in, was lighter than what had come before. Nash said he would be in touch about the estate proceedings, the civil suit now likely to be withdrawn in the absence of a plaintiff capable of pursuing it, and about the formal transfer of the remaining financial documentation to the DOJ's custody. He said there would be some months of procedural work still ahead, and that his office would handle the bulk of it. He said she should go home. She thanked him. He shook her hand with the warmth of a man who has been doing his professional duty and has found in the course of doing it something he had not entirely expected, a client who required not management, but partnership. He picked up his briefcases and walked to where his car was parked. She stood on the Hartford sidewalk for another moment. Then she walked to the public garage and retrieved her Jeep and drove north toward the Hudson Valley. The months that followed moved with the tempo of institutional process, slow, thorough, inexorable. Victor Kane's trial was scheduled for the following autumn. The federal charges were filed in March. In April, his assets were frozen pending the outcome of criminal proceedings, which meant that the firm of Kane and Associates went into voluntary dissolution in May, and the Hartford office closed its doors by the end of the month. The civil suit against the Hargrove estate was withdrawn in April, exactly as Nash had predicted. Margaret cooperated fully with federal investigators and was not charged. By summer, she had moved from the house in Greenwich, which had been seized as a marital asset, to a small apartment in Simsbury, where she lived quietly, and as far as Sloan knew from the occasional brief update Nash provided, without the social life she had spent the first half of her adulthood maintaining. In the autumn, Nash confirmed what Sloan had suspected when she drew the line in her notebook between the two Whitson names. Prescott Whitson's brother had served as the Connecticut State Police lieutenant assigned to the original investigation of Thomas Hargrove's crash. The connection had been deliberate, arranged by Victor in the same advanced planning spirit that had characterized everything else he had built. The brother retired from the force the same week the federal charges were filed and was the subject of a separate internal affairs inquiry. The outcome of that inquiry was not made public, but his retirement stood. Victor Kane was convicted the following November on all federal counts: the wire fraud and the embezzlement, and the conspiracy to commit murder in the death of Thomas Hargrove. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. The sentence was 27 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Sloan did not attend the sentencing hearing. She read about it in the Hartford Courant the following morning, sitting at the kitchen table of Hargrove Estate with her coffee. In the room where she had taken the call from Brett Kane at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday in November, and she sat with the information for a long time before she turned the page. Prescott Whitson received a suspended sentence and a civil fine of $1.2 million dollars and lost his banking license in a proceeding that received brief coverage in the financial press and then was forgotten. The 2 years following the conviction were in their way the most demanding of all, not because of external conflict, but because of the interior work of becoming a person who is not defined by the fight she has just finished. Sloan had spent 6 years counting the three in Bridgeport, and the three since the letter from Nash's office organizing her intelligence and her patience and her carefully accumulated evidence toward a single fixed point. Now the point had been reached. The fixed star was gone. She was for the first time since the door on Alderton Road had closed behind her, with a deadbolt navigating by something other than the bearing of that point. She found that she was suited for it. The same quality that had kept her going through the Bridgeport years, the patient accumulation, the refusal to stop noticing things, turned out to be equally useful in the construction of something new. She had always believed, though she had rarely let herself think it in explicit terms, that the estate was not ultimately hers in the possessive sense, but in the custodial sense that she held it not as a conclusion, but as a starting point. She hired a structural engineer in January of the year after the conviction, and they spent 3 months going through the house systematically documenting what needed restoration and what needed replacement and what simply needed care. The east wing was repointed, the bluestone cleaned and resealed. The porch was rebuilt to the original drawings, the carved brackets recreated by a craftsman she found in Kingston who specialized in Victorian restoration work and who understood, without needing it, explained in detail that the goal was not renovation, but faithful continuity. The formal gardens were restored over 2 seasons, working from old photographs she found in Dorothy's archive, and from the advice of a landscape architect in Poughkeepsie who specialized in historic properties. The weeping willows were properly trimmed for the first time in at least a decade and came back the following spring with the extravagant trailing clarity of their best selves. The bunker she had thought about most carefully. What Dorothy had built there was in its own way a monument to a particular kind of watchfulness that had served a necessary purpose in its time. But its time was not Sloane's time, and its purpose was not what she intended for the space. She worked with Nash in the Department of Justice to transfer the remaining physical archive to the appropriate federal custody, a process that took 4 months and resulted in 12 separate federal and state investigations into various individuals whose names had appeared in Dorothy's 40 years of careful record-keeping. When the last of Dorothy's materials had been removed, she stood in the empty bunker for a long time, in the clean, cold air of the climate control system, looking at the empty shelving and the server racks that had already been decommissioned. Then she called a contractor from Rhinebeck and began the renovation. The foundation and the reinforced walls remained, which meant the space retained its capacity for serious purpose. She installed new server infrastructure, modern and expandable, connected to fiber optic lines she had run from the road. She had the shelving replaced with workstations. She brought in a technology consultant from New York who specialized in nonprofit digital operations. A young woman from Albany named Turner, who wore paint-stained sneakers to client meetings and who understood, without needing it, explained that the goal was not a corporate data center, but something closer to a command center for organized care. They worked together for 3 months designing the operational infrastructure for what Sloan had decided the estate would become. The Thomas Hargrove Foundation launched in the spring in the third year after the conviction on a Tuesday morning in April, when the Hudson Valley was in the first clear green of early spring and the weeping willows along the driveway had come into their full trailing curtains of new growth, sweeping low and luminous in the morning light. The foundation's mission was specific. It provided legal advocacy, emergency housing, and full scholarship funding to minors across the United States who had been illegally emancipated or abandoned by their guardians in circumstances that involved financial exploitation. The pattern she knew from direct experience was more common and more systematic than anyone without that experience typically understood. It was not a broad or vague charitable mandate. It was the exact shape of what had been done to her, cut out in reverse, applied outward. The foundation's first cohort of scholarship recipients was announced in June. There were 11 of them, ranging in age from 17 to 22, from 7 different states. Each of them had a story that rhymed in its essential structure, with hers a trust manipulated a signature, coerced a door that had been deliberately closed. She read each file personally. She wrote each of them a letter herself, not a form letter, but an individual one specific to what she had read in their file. The kind of letter that says to a person, I see you in particular, not you as a category. She wrote about what she knew of their specific circumstances and what she had learned about the specific kind of resilience that circumstances like theirs either builds or breaks, and about the fact that getting this far to the age at which they were reading this letter meant something real about the quality of what they were made of. She did not use the word remarkable. She used the word specific, because specific was true and remarkable was comfort. The foundation received its first significant external grant in the fall from a family foundation in Boston whose trustees had known Thomas Hargrove professionally and who had followed the events surrounding his death and the subsequent trial with the engaged attention of people who understood that the story was not only about one family, but about a pattern of exploitation that operated in the margins of wealth and law, where the tools for accountability were accessible only to those who already had the resources to use them. The grant was substantial. It funded the foundation's operational budget for its first 3 years and allowed Sloan to bring on a full-time legal director and 2 case managers by the end of the calendar year. Elliot Nash joined the foundation's board of trustees that fall. He attended the first board meeting in the formal dining room of Hargrove Estate, which had been restored and reused for exactly this kind of occasion. The room fully lit now and warm and alive with the sound of purposeful conversation. The chandelier above the long table casting its light on people gathered around a shared intention. Nash sat at the far end of the table from Sloan and listened more than he spoke, which was, she had come to understand over 3 years of working with him the way he operated when he was most engaged. At the end of the meeting, he said the foundation was well designed, which was high praise from a man who did not use words for decoration. She turned 22 on a Thursday in November 3 years to the month after the letter from Nash's office had arrived at O'Malley's Diner in Bridgeport. She did not make a production of the occasion. She made dinner in the kitchen of the estate a real dinner, the kind that takes an hour and requires attention and fills the house with warmth and smell. And she ate at the kitchen table with the lights on and the Hudson Valley dark outside the windows, and she allowed herself to feel, fully and without management, the distance between this evening and the evening 3 years earlier, when she had eaten a gas station cupcake alone in a room above an auto repair shop and let herself feel the weight of everything that had been taken. The weight was not gone. It would not be gone. The weight of her father's death, of the years in Bridgeport, of the payphone, in January, of the 3 years she had spent becoming a person who could do what needed to be done, none of that was weightless now. It had simply become part of the structure rather than the obstruction. It had become in the way that her father had understood that well-designed buildings always work with, rather than against, the forces acting on them, load-bearing in the right direction. After dinner, she went upstairs to the room with the east-facing windows, the room she had chosen on her first night in the house because of its view across the formal garden to the tree line. She brought her coffee. She stood at the window in the dark, looking at nothing visible, just the mass of the trees against the darker mass of the sky, the absence of light that in Hudson Valley November is absolute and complete. No ambient glow from any distance. Just the quiet dark of land that has been there for a very long time and will be there for a very long time more. She pressed the fingers of her right hand together and felt the weight of the signet ring held in place by the tape inside the band, the engraved crest she had traced with her fingertip as a very small child. She had thought many times about having the ring resized. She had not done it yet. The tape was a minor inconvenience and a specific kind of reminder that she found on reflection she was not ready to give up. The ring was too large for her finger and always had been, and keeping it required a small, constant act of intention, and that seemed right to her in a way she had never needed to explain to anyone. Outside in the dark, the bare-limbed trees of November stood at the edge of what she could see exactly as they had stood on the first night she came to this house. She had been a 19-year-old woman with $47 in a diner jacket and a brass key, and a brown leather notebook standing at the front of a house full of secrets that had been waiting for her. The secrets had been revealed. The accounting had been made. The people who had built their lives on the destruction of hers had met the end that destruction warranted. And she was standing in a house full of light in a valley her family had lived in for 4 generations, with work in front of her that was built from everything that had been done to her and directed toward making sure it was less easily done to others. That was not a small thing. It was, she thought, exactly the kind of thing her father would have recognized as architecture. The transformation of a difficult site into something that serves and endures and outlasts the conditions that made its construction necessary. She stood at the window until her coffee was cold, and then a little longer, not because she was sad or suspended, but because the dark and the silence of the valley at that hour had a quality she had come to value, the quality of a world that simply continues patient and exact while you stand in it and find your bearings. Then she turned away from the window and went downstairs to her desk, where there were 11 letters still to be written, one for each of the Foundation's first scholarship recipients, each one specific and direct and personal, each one carrying the full weight of everything she knew about what it meant to be 16 years old and alone and without a door to go back through. She sat down at the desk where her father's aunt had once sat in the house her father's family had built, with her father's ring on her right hand. She uncapped her pen. The lamp made a warm circle of light on the clean surface of the desk. Outside, the valley held its quiet. She began to write.